Welcome to Figments of the Brain, a philosophy podcast recorded at the University of Cologne. Figments of the Brain is produced by Concept, the Cologne Center of Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian tradition. Every episode we pick a topic for a roundtable discussion among the members of Concept. Sometimes we also interview other philosophers on a selected topic. We welcome your feedback. To get in touch and learn more about the center, please visit www.concept-phil.de. That's www.concept-phil.de. We hope you enjoy our podcast.
So welcome everybody to the Knowledge Router. So it's our colloquium here at the University of Cologne and Concept. And it's our great honor to have Katherine Hawley with us today. She took her PhD at Cambridge. She's been at St. Andrews since. She's got books on trust and the metaphysics of persistence. She has numerous papers in metaphysics and epistemology, and one of my personal favorites is her paper on success and knowledge how. That's been very influential for me and thinking about know-how. And she's going to give a talk today on, forgive me, I'm forgetting the exact title.
I think I might have changed it. It's either Impostor Syndrome or What is Impostor Syndrome? Either of those.
All right. And then we'll have comments afterwards by Deborah Marver and Lenny Smith. So it sounds like your talk will be about 30 minutes, and then we'll have comments. You'll have a chance to follow up, and then we'll have Q&A, so fairly standard format. So we're very excited to have you. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you. That's a very generous introduction. Let me just try and share my screen. Let's hope this goes okay. Well, thank you. So thank you to everyone at Concept for inviting me to give this presentation, and to the commentators and everyone else for showing up on a kind of grey Friday afternoon before Christmas. I am going to speak for about half an hour, as we've said, and it's going to be based on a paper which I published last year in the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society called What is Impostor Syndrome? But I'm not going to try and present absolutely everything I say in that paper. I'm just going to keep to a few kind of key points, and also hopefully the points that are relevant for the comments by Deb and Leonie. Okay, good. So let's get going. So imposter syndrome is a topic which I think is not normally taken as the subject matter for philosophical investigation. So sometimes we talk about imposter syndrome as something that people in philosophy may experience or be prone to, but we don't think of it as something which merits philosophical investigation in its own right. But I think that's a mistake. I think it's a really sort of rich and interesting thing for us to be thinking about as philosophers and in particular as epistemologists, actually, because it's got a lot of kind of interesting aspects to do with self-knowledge in particular. So what I'm going to do today is kind of, first of all, speak for a few minutes about what imposter syndrome is sort of generally thought to be by psychologists and in popular culture. And then I'm going to give some more sort of kind of critical analysis about why I think the standard ways of thinking about imposter syndrome are a bit mistaken, and where philosophy might have something to contribute in improving this concept and making it more useful for various purposes. Okay, so the first thing you have to find out when you're working on imposter syndrome, first of all, is how to spell imposter, and that was a bit of a drama for me at the beginning, because you can spell it with an E at the end, and as far as I can tell, this isn't like a UK-US difference, it's just a random difference. So I'm going for the two O's, but perhaps a little bit more significantly, oh no, I'm trying to get to my next slide and it's not moving. Oh, there we go. Yes. What you quickly discover when you look to the psychological research on this is that they call it imposter phenomenon rather than imposter syndrome. And this is really a topic for another day, but one thing I'm curious about is how imposter phenomenon from the psychology literature sort of burst out, became a cultural phenomenon as imposter syndrome, and why the name changed as that happened. I think there's some interesting things going on there, partly about the sort of medical sounding aspects of calling something a syndrome. But what is it supposed to be? Well, imposter phenomenon, here's a nice quote from a review article from 2011. Imposter phenomenon was identified from clinical observations during therapeutic sessions with high achieving women by Dr. Pauline Clance, and this is in the 1970s. Well, what was she identifying? Well, she noticed this pattern where, despite objective evidence of success, these women had a pervasive psychological experience believing that they were intellectual frauds, and they feared being recognized as imposters. They suffered from anxiety, fear of failure, and dissatisfaction with life. So here we've got the kind of key points about what imposter syndrome is still thought of. It's the idea that this is the label we use for people who kind of on the outside have lots of measures of success. So if they're students, they get high grades, or if they're professionals, they've been appointed to a competitive job, they've been promoted maybe. If they do creative work, maybe they get good reviews for their work, or they've won prizes. So there's all these kind of external markers of success and talent, and yet somehow the people know about these, right? It's not that they don't know what their grades are, or they don't know that they've won a prize. But nevertheless, they, as it's often put, people with imposter syndrome don't internalize their success, or they don't internalize the evidence in some way. So they don't convert what they know about these external markers into a kind of internal state of believing that they are talented and successful, and they don't believe that they kind of deserve to be where they are. And then along with that, there's these words here we see about kind of like anxiety and fear and dissatisfaction and so on. And often with that, there's this idea that one day they're going to be discovered and everyone will realize what a fraud they are. So that's the kind of sort of standard characterization of what imposter syndrome is supposed to be. Here's a diagram which is helpful from the same, well, it's from the same review article, but it's also based on the book by Pauline Clance, who's the person who first started talking about this. So I'll just talk you through this. So we start with someone being given an achievement-related task. So it's something to do at work or in your university studies where there's a kind of defined thing that you're supposed to be doing or producing, and not just kind of getting it done, but getting it done to a high standard. And the idea is that someone who has imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, once they're given this task and they start to have anxiety, self-doubt, worry, they basically worry they're not going to be able to do it well enough or not going to be able to meet the appropriate standards. And then we see there's sort of two kinds of response that can come up. One is the thought that, oh, I'm not good enough. I don't have the talent, the capability to do well at this. All I can do is sort of try and compensate by that by working really, really hard. This is the over-preparation route. So people do this, then because sort of by definition, actually these people are pretty good at their jobs, they manage to get the accomplishment done. It's a feeling of relief. They get positive feedback. Again, that's sort of built into what we're talking about when we talk about imposter syndrome. It's people whose work is generally regarded by others as being good. But then the key thing that happens is that the person thinks, for whatever reason, they discount the positive feedback. They don't take it seriously as reflecting on their own talent and achievements. Rather, they just think, oh, it's just because I worked so hard. I had to work much harder than everyone else, perhaps they think. It's not because I'm really good at this. And this leads to more perceived fraudulence, increased self-doubt, potentially depression or anxiety. And then we go around the loop again, because then there's another task that someone gets taken on, someone is given. A different route that some people take is this procrastination route, whereas instead of over-preparing, you just sort of put it off and do it all the last minute. It works out okay, but you don't take the positive feedback seriously. You just think, oh, I was just lucky this time, I got away with it. Next time it'll all go wrong and people will realize what a disaster I am. Actually, when I first saw this kind of cycle diagram, I was struck that kind of academic work allows for a perfect combination of over-preparation and procrastination, right? Because you can read and read and read and think and think and think, and that becomes a way of procrastinating on the actual writing or preparing your slides or whatever you're supposed to be doing. Okay, so this is the kind of way in which, I've taken these summaries from a review article in a psychology journal. This is the kind of psychology way of thinking about it. Let me just tell you a few other things about how imposter syndrome is thought about and studied in general terms. It's not a diagnosable psychiatric condition in the sense that it's not in the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So it seems like for some people it can lead to, or at least can be correlated, in extreme cases, people can end up with clinical depression or with anxiety that itself, they themselves are psychiatric conditions that are diagnosable in this way. But imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon in and of itself is not one of those categories. Nevertheless, as I'm sure many of you will know, it's something that is really widely discussed, both in sort of self-help literature, both at the really sort of cheesy end of the scale and also the more sophisticated end of the scale. If you look up, for example, if you look on Amazon, there are kind of various categories that are like kind of like women in business or women's career advice or that kind of thing, or how to get ahead in your career. And you'll see many books and books which discuss imposter syndrome in that context. It also comes up in many quite serious contexts in if you see materials for diversity or kind of mentoring training. This is supposed to be something you're supposed to be aware of if you're trying to help other people who may have imposter syndrome. So it's thought of as a kind of thing that holds people back in their careers. Sorry, yeah, so here's just to illustrate, so I said it's widely discussed. So this is Pauline Clancy's book. So she did the initial research in the 70s, and she published this book in the mid 80s that was written for a general audience, and that seems to have kind of been the start of it being popularized. Here's Sheryl Sandberg, Lean In. There's lots of research references in this book, and quite a lot of them are to do with imposter syndrome. And then here's this book by Valerie Young, which, as far as I can tell, is, in my opinion, is the best sort of popularly oriented book about imposter syndrome. Again, it's quite well informed by lots of research studies. And there's an interesting kind of tension here that we'll come back to later. So the book is called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. But then the subtitle is about capable people and how they suffer from imposter syndrome. And again, this is kind of ambivalence as to whether this is really a kind of a distinctively women's problem or just something that many different men and women can suffer from. Okay, so how do psychologists study it? They use something called the Clance scale. So again, back to Pauline Clance. I'll just run over this very briefly. It's one of these things where you ask people to kind of think about themselves and place themselves on a scale. So there are 20 questions. Here are just 5 of them, just to read out a couple. I've often succeeded on a test or task, even though I was afraid I would not do well before I undertook the task. You have to think about how much that characterizes you. When people praise me for something I've accomplished, I'm afraid I won't be able to live up to what their expectations of me in the future. Again, you have to think about how much that applies to you. And so they take people through these 20 things, they tick the appropriate boxes. That gives you a number out of 100. That puts you on a scale of imposterism, as it were. And then the psychologist will then look to see, well, okay, so a high score on this scale, is this correlated with various character traits, for example? So one suggestion is it's correlated with perfectionism. Is it correlated with gender or race or other social categories? Is it correlated with something to do with how your parents thought about achievement, how you were brought up to think about this kind of thing? So, but this Clance scale is really the foundation for all of this research in social psychology. But what do they find when they study this? Well, really a mixed bag. I mean, that's my opinion on the literature as I found it, but that's not just me coming and being a philosopher and being unhelpful. That's also something that you see the psychologists themselves saying, is that there are very mixed research findings in this area. So it's not clear really whether more women than men suffer from imposter syndrome. Perhaps a kind of more subtle way of explaining the idea that it's a women's problem is this idea that you're more likely to suffer from imposter syndrome if you're a minority in the field in which you're trying to succeed. So obviously women are not a minority in the world, but especially these 70s cases, 1970s cases, it was often about women trying to succeed in male-dominated professions. And of course, there's lots of other ways in which you might be a minority, whether it's your racial or ethnic belonging, or social class, or your native language. There's lots of ways in which you can be a minority in the field in which you're trying to succeed. But there are these other studies as well. You quite often see this figure that up to 70% of us have imposter syndrome, in which case you might either think, well, this is a totally useless category. What's the point of having something like this if 70% of people fall under it? Or you might think, oh my goodness, this is like a mental health emergency. 70% of people have this terrible condition. There's different ways of responding to that. So my sort of general point here is to say, look, there is this psychology research, and individual studies are often very interesting, but you don't get a very kind of clear and cohesive picture of what imposter syndrome is and how it's distributed from these studies seen as a whole. And that's one reason I think that we philosophers may have a role to play. I think this is often a kind of healthy way of thinking about the relationship between philosophy and scientific investigations, is that philosophers can't sort of take the place of the scientists, but often we can kind of come in and give welcome or unwelcome advice about kind of conceptual clarification, or about different sorts of questions that we might want to ask about a phenomenon that perhaps has been understudied so far. Here's my general claim, and that's obviously very vague, right? So I hope you'll agree with this at least by the end of the talk. But here's a couple more connected specific claims I want to make today. One is I'm going to try to make the case that imposter attitudes, these sort of self-doubts, can be an epistemically reasonable response to a difficult social environment. And indeed, I'm going to suggest that that's quite often what's going on. So when we think of people, or someone seems to be a candidate for having imposter syndrome, I'm going to suggest it's quite often the case that they're not being irrational. It's not that they're just not internalizing their evidence, or kind of thinking badly, or kind of messed up in how they're sort of their attitudes to themselves, but rather they may be responding in actually sort of justified or kind of warranted ways to the actual total picture of evidence that they've got. So that's something I'm going to focus on today. And then relatively, I think that gives us some suggestions about what to do if we're thinking about how to treat, I mean, that's a sort of medical word, but how to sort of address imposter syndrome or help people get over their imposter syndrome or get over our own imposter syndrome if we have it ourselves. I think we should be moving away from thinking about it as a sort of individual pathology. So that's as I said, there's more stuff in the published paper, but this is the kind of key things I want to focus on today. And also there's sort of further question. I think once as we're going to do, we're going to go through and think about these issues about the environment and what's sort of epistemically reasonable. That raises a question about whether we should be ameliorating, to use Sally Haslanger's term, the concept of imposter syndrome. Should we be kind of refining it or changing it in some way that will actually make it a more useful concept to work with? And I'll just talk very briefly at the end about what useful might mean there, what our goals might be. Okay, so I've talked about imposter attitudes there, and I've also talked about imposter syndrome. What's the connection between these? Well, imposter syndrome must involve persistent and mistaken imposter attitudes. I'm not going to spell those out, those different notions. Persistent, right? So it's totally reasonable and healthy to have self-doubt from time to time, right? If you never kind of question whether you're capable enough for something you're about to take on, or whether your work is really good enough or something like that, either you're just a kind of crazed narcissist, or it may be another explanation why that might be is that you're in a situation where you're just kind of never challenged, right? Maybe you're not able to get a job that's really sort of stretching you, and that could be another reason. But to a certain degree, but for most of us, having some self-doubts from time to time is healthy and a good thing, and shouldn't mean that we have imposter syndrome. So these self-doubts are going to be persistent. And also, I want to suggest that they have to be mistaken in some way. I'll talk in a moment about what I mean by mistaken, but just to give you a first clue, someone who just actually is bad at their job, they're out of their depth, they can't manage, what they come up with is not good enough, and they realize that that's someone we might feel sympathetic to, and they've got problems, but that's not someone who has imposter syndrome. The idea of imposter syndrome is that there's a kind of mismatch between the real situation and how the person sees themselves. Okay, so we've got persistent and mistaken imposter attitudes. What are these attitudes? I've been talking about doubt, self-doubt, but to sort of simplify, we might think about belief, right? So an imposter attitude might be the belief that my work is no good, just to simplify, or, important parts of my work, or my work is not good enough, something like that, or I'm not talented enough. Anecdotally, quite a number of people have said to me that they have these kind of doubts, but they don't outright believe that their work is no good. It's more that they can't bring themselves to believe that it is good. So we might be a bit more careful and say, well, what the core imposter attitude is an absence of belief, a failure to believe that my work is good enough, or that my work is good. It's a bit harder to spell out how to make that work in terms of justification, but that's perhaps a more accurate way of capturing what's going on. But we might think that this is, imposter syndrome is not just about belief or absence of belief. It's also, there's an important affective kind of emotional side to it. So there's the questions on the scale that I showed you earlier, and the other kind of characterizations, informal and formal. Well, it's not informal, kind of the more scientific characterizations and the more pop culture characterizations of imposter syndrome often put a lot of focus on the fear of being found out, of being unmasked, and kind of anxiety that goes along with it. I've also been thinking more recently about feelings of guilt and shame in this connection. So that would be, I'm not going to talk about that here today, but I'd be very happy to talk about that in the discussion if anyone's interested. But it seems like this is going to at least commonly go along with the imposter beliefs. And I'm partly amazing this because I think both Deb and Leonie in different ways are going to talk about kind of feelings or emotions or kind of affective attitudes and how they fit in with imposter syndrome. But what I'm going to talk about in my presentation is the connection between imposter syndrome and mistaken beliefs. Right? So I'm going to talk about beliefs rather than absence of belief, just to make the presentation simpler. And I'll leave others to think about the affective states. Okay, so what is it for a belief to be mistaken? Well, as epistemologists, we're incredibly familiar with the idea that that a belief can be mistaken in the sense of being false, and as rather than true, and that there's a kind of a different sense, a different dimension along which we evaluate beliefs, which is that we evaluate them as to whether they're justified or unjustified, or we might say, warranted or unwarranted. There's different sort of terminology that we use in this area, but there's a kind of sort of package of normative concepts we use. And it's perhaps, I don't know about the most basic distinction in epistemology, but one of the most basic ones, it's one of the ones you start with when you try and teach epistemology, is to point out there's a difference between a belief being false and it being unjustified, and a difference between it being true and it being justified, right? So we've got all the permutations. And, familiarly, it's kind of nice to have both, right? It's nice to have true beliefs, justified beliefs. It's nice that they count as knowledge as well. That's maybe an issue for another day. But we're very familiar with the idea that there's these two different dimensions of evaluation. But those two dimensions get run together, I think, in most discussions of imposter syndrome. And what I want to do is see what happens when we pull them apart, as we should. So I'm just going to run you through, there's a sort of four-way table here. So I'm going to think about what happens when your imposter beliefs are true, but justified, true and justified, true and unjustified, false and unjustified, and false and unjustified. And then I'll explain why that's relevant to thinking about what imposter syndrome is. So here's one possibility. So one possibility is that I think I'm bad at my job, and I am bad at my job, and I'm justified in thinking that. I've got lots of evidence that I'm bad at my job. I want to say that's, by definition, this isn't, but if I'm in that situation, I don't have imposter syndrome. I've got different sorts of problems, but not imposter syndrome. It's worth noting that someone with imposter syndrome is going to think that this is their situation, right? And there is something intriguing about the idea that a person with imposter syndrome thinks that they're bad at their job, they're bad at lots of things in their life, but the one thing they're good at is noticing how bad they are, right? So there's a kind of mixed thing there. But anyway, this is not going to count as imposter syndrome. Here's another possible situation. You can imagine someone who believes that they're bad at their job, and they're correct, they are bad at their job, but their belief is unjustified. They've arrived at that belief for bad reasons. Maybe they read it in a horoscope, or there's just a kind of one mean bully at work that tells them that, even though they've got lots of evidence that points in the other direction. Again, I want to say this: someone in that situation doesn't have imposter syndrome because they really are bad at their job. But they're not. They in some sense they are an imposter. This is a somewhat unlikely combination, right? We can think of the scenarios where it could come up, but I think this is not going to be a sort of common situation. But it's very easy to worry that you are in this situation. I think, especially once you've heard of imposter syndrome, you can kind of think that you're bad at your job, and you can sort of also be semi-aware that you shouldn't really think that, because you know that people praise your work, and so maybe you think that this belief is unjustified, but you still have it. And there's as is often the case, where you believe that you have a belief, and at the same time you think that your belief is unjustified. There's a kind of self-undermining element to that sort of combination of states. That's kind of intriguing, but again, I'm happy to talk about that in discussion, but I don't want to count this as imposter syndrome. Here is the third kind of combination that I think is probably what most people are thinking of when we think about imposter syndrome. And in this scenario, I'm not bad at my job. This imposter attitude is false. It's a mistake in that sense. And I'm unjustified in thinking that. So I believe it, but I shouldn't think it because it's false and it's unjustified. Why is it unjustified? Well, because I've got all this evidence that I'm good at my job, right? I've got a pay rise, let's say, or I get praised for what I'm doing, and so on and so on. And I think this is often what the kind of common characterizations of imposter syndrome. This is what people have in mind. But there's this fourth box, which I think, is in a way the most interesting one. Now I want to think of people who are not bad at their job, right? So their beliefs are false. They think they're bad at their jobs. That's false. They are good at their jobs, but they're justified in having that false belief. They justifiably believe they're bad at their job. I think this is assumed to be unlikely in these sorts of cases, because what we're thinking is, well, surely the person knows that they have good grades, that they got a pay rise, they got a promotion, they got a prize, or whatever it might be. So how could they be justified in thinking, nevertheless, that they're bad at their job? But what I want to suggest to you is that this is actually a fairly common predicament. This could happen pretty quite often. How am I going to try and justify that claim? I'm just going to give you a few examples of ways in which it could come up, and hopefully you'll be able to sort of recognize the kind of thing I'm talking about. These are various empirical studies. So this is in quite a study where they sent letters to professors about potential doctoral study, and signed them with different names or put different little details in, and these letters got more positive responses when they were apparently written by white men as opposed to men of minority background or women. Why is that relevant? Well, you can imagine these men of minority background or women, if this is replicated in real life, are getting, that's the kind of negative feedback they're getting about their capabilities, which is going to be misleading them about whether they really are capable of doctoral study, at least relative to the white guys. I like this one. Male biology students rated other males as more knowledgeable than females, even when in fact the female students were performing better on class assessments. So again, on the assumption that you pick up these subtle hints from other people about what they think of you and how you're doing, the male and female students in that class were going to be getting different sorts of feedback that could be potentially misleading. Here are these studies. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with these kind of things. Student evaluations of online teachers were more positive when the teachers were given a male name rather than a female name, and everything else was otherwise identical. What I'm trying to suggest here is that, very briefly, is that for all of us, none of us, whether we have imposter syndrome or not, none of us forms our belief about our own capabilities and achievements solely on the basis of things like grades and pay rises and prizes. We also bring in a lot of other evidence, which is partly about our own judgment of our own work, our experience of how difficult it is for us to produce our work, and also lots of kind of subtle feedback, conscious and unconscious, that we get from other people. There's a really kind of complex set of evidence going on there. And if we're lucky, that all kind of adds up to a nice kind of coherent picture that tells us accurately about what our strengths and weaknesses are. But what I want to suggest is there's lots of sort of interfering factors in the environment that can mess up that picture and present a kind of much more confusing array of evidence, a kind of positive and negative, that can make it justified for someone to end up thinking they don't have skills that in fact they do have. Let me give you a slightly more cheerful example. I borrowed this from the sociologist Katherine Hawley's website. I'll give you the link at the end. So this is just for comedy value really, but it's, I think it makes the point. So he says, the US grad student guide to interpreting feedback from faculty trained in the UK. So the UK professor, like myself, says, I hear what you say. And the US grad student says, oh, well, they agree with me. And what I really mean is I disagree and I don't want to discuss it any further. And so on and so on. So the idea is kind of the UK professors are kind of so low key that the US grad student can't tell when they're being criticized. But of course it works the other way around as well. Is the UK grad student trying to understand American faculty. The American faculty says, that's awesome. And the grad student thinks, great, my work is amazing. And all that was really meant was, well, that's okay. And there's many more of that. Especially it's Friday afternoon. After my talk, of course, I recommend you go and check out the full thing at the website. Again, what's the point? My point here, the slightly more serious point, is that, again, this doesn't have to be to do with race or gender, right? There's kind of all sorts of cultural differences or just different communication skills can make it quite hard to understand what feedback you're being given, even when the other person is sincerely trying to give you accurate, helpful feedback. Okay, so remember, this is my general claim. We need philosophers on the case, and I've been trying to make a brief argument for this claim that imposter attitudes can, in many situations, be an epistemically reasonable response to a difficult social environment, even when, I want to stress, even when the beliefs are in fact false, right? So these are people who are talented and capable, but they end up in a situation where it's quite reasonable for them to doubt that. And then I want to suggest that we should take this into account when we're thinking about how to address imposter syndrome. That was all a bit quick, but I just want to make a little time in the last few minutes to think about, oh, sorry, yes, there's one more, here's a slide. Yeah, I found this a helpful analogy for a number of reasons. So public health scientists, when they think about obesity. I know there's lots of kind of sensitive issues and how to talk about obesity and how to think about that and the relationship between obesity and health. But nevertheless, I think it's still, so noting that, I wanted to mention that this concept of obesogenic environment seems to be useful in that area of public health. And the point here is that when thinking about why do different people have different weights, why do some people weigh more than others, potentially at risk for their health, it's kind of tempting to think, well, we've got to look at the person, right? So let's look at how much they're eating, what they're eating, how much they're exercising, other factors about this person, maybe genetic factors or whatever. But it turns out that just doing that, if that's all you do, you miss out a really important part of the picture, right? And that's the important part of the picture is this idea that many people live in environments where it's really hard to find healthy food, or it's expensive to get that. It's hard to get exercise. Maybe there's no sidewalks. You've got pavements. You've got to drive anywhere that's worth getting to, and so on. So some people, that part of the explanation there, some people are living in environments which make it much more likely that they will have a higher weight than others, and ignoring those environmental pictures. Ignoring those environmental factors, means that you're not going to fully understand what's going on. And what I'm trying to suggest here is something like that may be the case for imposter syndrome. Just looking at the individual person and why they and how they reason about their grades and that kind of thing is not going to give you the whole picture about why some people are more prone to imposter syndrome than others. Okay, so then this brings us to this final brief question, which is, how might this affect, if you go along with this, if you agree that we should be looking at these environmental factors, not just looking at the individuals, then how should that affect the concept of imposter syndrome? I've suggested that both in psychology and in pop culture, discussions of imposter syndrome tend to assume that imposter attitudes are usually unjustified, right? Because we start with the idea that the person's got the evidence of their success, so if they don't believe in themselves, then they're just somehow, they must be ignoring that evidence or handling it badly. And I've argued that actually lots of people are in a situation where they've got false imposter attitudes and yet they're justified. But now we come to the question of, well, do these people have imposter syndrome? All right, we've got a couple of options. We might say, well, no, right? If you're justified in these attitudes, then you don't really have imposter syndrome. You've got a different kind of problem, which is that you're in a kind of confusing epistemic environment, and you've got a mistaken belief about yourself. But if your beliefs are justified, then you're not going to count as having imposter syndrome. That would be one way of developing the concept. Here's a different way of doing it. Like you might say, no, let's welcome all comers. Let's define imposter syndrome so that you can have what it takes to have imposter syndrome is to have a false self-doubt, a false belief that you're no good at your job, but that can be justified or unjustified. One way of just kind of seeing how this might spell out to kind of have ramifications would be on this narrow concept. We would end up saying, well, look, a lot of people have been labeled with this imposter syndrome label, but really they don't have imposter syndrome. They're just unlucky because they are in a sort of hostile social epistemic environment that makes it difficult for them to know what they're good at. That's how we would speak if we were using the narrow concept. On the broad concept, we would instead say, gosh, lots of people have imposter syndrome, not because they reason badly, but because they're in hostile social epistemic environments. So there's kind of two ways in which you might think about that. I'm not going to jump for one of those or the other today, but I see whether I think some of this may come out of the comments. Here's an even broader possibility. You might think that is it possible to have imposter syndrome without having the actual belief that you're no good, or even lacking the belief that you are good? Perhaps it's just, if we just have the kind of affective attitudes, the anxiety and so on that goes along with it, could that count as imposter syndrome? That might be a further question. How are we going to try and address this? I'm conscious of the time, so I'm not going to run through all of this, but let me just show you the kind of questions I have in mind. Right, we might, in order to try and work out which concept to use, we're going to need to think about what problems we're trying to solve using this concept. Right, so are we trying to eliminate imposter syndrome or eliminate imposter attitudes? Are we trying to make people feel better about themselves? Are we trying to perhaps further the scientific investigation of imposter syndrome? There's some different sort of projects we might have here, and they might not all point to the same concept. There's this question as ever about who we are here, which concept we want to use. It may be that different groups would benefit from having different concepts, either different, social groups in terms of race or gender or other identities, but also it may be that one concept might be useful for the people who have imposter syndrome, and a different concept might be useful for the people who are trying to study imposter syndrome. Finally, I'll leave you with this thought that we might wonder, I've started to wonder this, whether this concept can do more harm than good. It's just almost always assumed that telling people about imposter syndrome, as I'm doing today, kind of consciousness raising about the existence of imposter syndrome is somehow supposed to be helpful in helping people get over it. I've become less persuaded of that the more I've thought about it. However, it may be too late for me to just confiscate the concept. I guess it's out there, so we don't have the option of trying to get rid of it. It's going to be more about trying to make it more useful or more illuminating. So as I said, the talk's based on elements of this What is Imposter Syndrome paper that I published last year. And if you're interested in this topic, I really recommend a lovely paper by Sarah Paul that was published in part of the same symposium as What Should Imposter Syndrome Be? But for now, I will stop, and I look forward to the comments and also everyone's discussion. Thank you.
On our homepage at www.concept-phil.de.